as I mentioned off the top, Evan's going to talk a little bit about a project he's been doing. Now, started it kind of in a little bit the year before, like we tried a couple fields, and then kind of the project has really got going in earnest this year. But Evan's working on a project with UPEI, with Adazaz and the team there, and they're working on using soil electroconductivity and soil mapping to do variable rate planting. So I'm going to let Evan go to it.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I'll two topics in here, kind of related to what Harold was talking about on his farm, but we'll get into those here. So, yeah, the whole project's basically around looking at variable rate planting. So why would we consider something like that? Well, we know even if we dig a plant or a couple plants up, we can see a lot of variability in terms of size profile, and we know that there's, there can be differences within our fields. The trucks fill up, a little bit slower in some areas, and they might fill up a little faster. We got 100 feet down the hill. In this field here, this is just a regular color satellite image. Now this is potatoes in the middle of July. It's a really sandy area of PEI. But basically these are hilltops, sandy soil, likely a little history of erosion. And if you look at the satellite pictures of that field year after year, that's basically what it looks like. No matter what the crop is, and basically no matter what the weather is, even if we have a good year with moisture, we're seeing these patterns through the field. And that's probably an extreme example. You see it blending over even into this field here. But why would we treat that whole field the same if we have the ability to change things a little bit? And that's where variable rate planting can help us. So it kind of might seem a little bit pie in the sky. Right now there's not a ton of equipment on PEI capable. There's a handful of planters now that can actually do it, but these newer planters are able to take a shapefile and basically adjust seed spacing within row as it goes through the field according to the maps that we make. Now, it's one thing to have the equipment to do it. It's what we're trying to figure out is what's the right recipe, what's the right what's the right way to go about it, and how do we create these maps for doing variable rate seed spacing. So that's where a little bit of the gap is. Now there's been some research done. This is a study from Germany a few years ago. They made zones strictly out of electrical conductivity. So just like Harold said, he had a Varus on his farm. With SWAT maps, there's quite a few acres in here that have been done. With SWAT maps, it's just a different electrical conductivity sensor, but it's measuring the exact same thing. So in that study, they found profitability increases of up to about $100 an acre Canadian. This is a more recent study here. They used some EC zones as well as measured a number of different soil nutrient values to try and come up with zones, and they found up to about $250 an acre Canadian profitability increase. So one thing we often hear of when it comes to kind of zones in agriculture, and Harold didn't talk about it, but we often hear about yield maps and things like that. Now, we don't have a long history of yield maps with potato harvesters here, but yield maps are great. You get a report card at the end of the year as to how the field did, but they can be impacted by hundreds of different things, right? Like kind of a guide to get an idea on maybe some trends. And if we have combine yield data, that's helpful too, because there are some issues with yield data from crops that are actually coming from underneath the ground as opposed to on top. Sometimes the combine yield data might be a little bit more accurate. And also with combine yield data, sometimes we don't pay as much attention to those crops in terms of feeding them and helping them succeed as much as we do with potatoes. So the combine yield data might be a little bit more, might be indicating a little bit more soil characteristics in the field. So what are the stable factors in the field from year to year that aren't really changing, but they do have a big influence on yield? There's been some research done on PEI to try and identify what are the main factors. Ryan was involved in this one, along with some Agriculture Canada researchers, and Steve Watts was there as well, looking at what were the main drivers of yield differences in the field in potatoes. And one of the main factors they found was soil texture. So with our, predominantly rain-fed potato production, we have sandy loam soils. Where we're seeing a little bit more soil water holding capacity generally is where we're seeing increased yields in the field. Another older study here from the late 90s when Bessie was involved there, Rhonda Hahn, a few from the Provincial Department of Agriculture, looking at using the the yield monitors in the early days, but trying to tie that back to what was the erosion history on the field. How was that impacting yield? And we're talking here about on the highly eroded sections of the field, we're seeing reduced yields, smaller tubers, and a higher population of stones. So we're doing a good job here to kind of manage erosion. Tobin and their crew doing a good job on trying to limit it in the future, but it's hard to reverse some of the impacts that have happened. We know how long it can take to build up things like topsoil and organic matter. So one of the ways variable rate planting can help is just managing those differences a little bit. Instead of planting everything with the same rate, maybe we can adjust things a bit based on some of the field history. So for this study, we're using SWOT maps, which is basically a combination of electrical conductivity and topography. So topography is determining where is water flowing on the field, where does it shed, and where does it collect. And electrical conductivity is basically measuring those differences, related to soil texture. So what's that soil battery like? How much moisture can it hold? How much nutrients can it hold onto? In this field here, there's a little heavier area. This is the western field from this study. A little heavier area here. When they were mapping the field, you got stuck solid right in here and had to get pulled out. So those are kind of maps that a farmer may know in their head. It's a little bit harder to turn that into something like a variable rate prescription. And we find that EC alone or topography alone may not be the best answer, but combining them together provides a little bit better zone map. So when it's all said and done, we have a map with 10 zones, and that sounds like a lot, and we can combine them after. It's easier to combine them later than to try and make more if you only start with maybe 2 or 3. So I'll talk about some of the reasons why it might be better to kind of separate things out a little bit, because we often see the better yielding areas of our fields in PEI are more these green sections, just because they're not as moisture limited as the water shedding hilltops. Perhaps they haven't had the erosion history of a hilltop that's been exposed to wind and water erosion, and over time they seem to generally yield pretty well, no matter if it's a wet or a dry year, in comparison with the rest of the field. But we can see issues like this. So this is early last summer in a field in eastern PEI. I was just driving along the road and I thought it was a pretty good image to try and think about the different zones within a field. So we have kind of a higher slope area here, probably I'm guessing 5 or 6% slope there. A little bit of history of erosion, and it's probably showing through a little bit in the canopy development. And then same thing down here, we got kind of a zone 10 area, depression area, where water's sitting between the rows. And basically it's all kind of tied to water, right? Like this area is probably shedding water a little quicker. This area it's all collecting, and it's impacting the way that the crop grows, and likely having an impact all the way through the season, right through the harvest. And then kind of these lower landscape zones that aren't quite at the area or at the spot where they're holding water between the rows, but a little bit more productive in here, and that's what we typically see from year to year. So those are the spots in the field that we might try and push a little bit harder and maybe manage our risk a little bit more on spots like this and this. So 3 fields on PEI. This particular field that had clear waters. I didn't do anything as far as shape files to feed the tractor for variable rate planting. All we did was strip trials through the field. So their standard rate here, I'll apologize, I'm flipping between metric and standard. Their standard rate was 14-inch spacing. So we did 2 strips of 12-inch in the blue, and we did 2 strips of 16-inch in the purple. And then I dug 36 10-foot strips per field and graded those out for size profile. So the central field here was in Tryon. This was a variety called Juanita, which I wasn't familiar with, but the standard spacing here was already pretty tight. It was about 9-inch, and we went 7 3/4 and then 10 1/4. So same thing, buried it in 2 strips. Those are 2 planter passes wide each strip, and then I kind of strategically placed the points to try and get all the different zones and see how each treatment responded. So I wasn't going in thinking like this is the way I should do it. I wanted to lay everything out and let the information kind of tell us how it should be, what the best strategy might be. The final field was down east, up east, I guess. So standard spacing here on these burr banks was 16 inch, so we did 2 strips at 14 inch and we did 2 strips at 18 inch. Same thing there, those were the harvest strips we're taken from. So before kind of the end of the season, it's one thing to say we planted these at 14 inch or 16 inch, but I wanted to get an idea like what was the actual spacing. I mean, we can go out and measure a few plants with a measuring tape and get a decent idea, but I played around with this a couple of years ago and using a drone to fly really low over the field and basically can map out where every single plant is. If you get it at the right time, when the plants aren't too small and they're not quite touching each other, you can map every single plant in the field. So the numbers that you're seeing on the screen there are how many inches one plant is from the next. So when you take that information and look at 300,000 plants, you can get a pretty good idea on what the actual spacings were after emergence. Now there's spots where you'll see gaps. A plant might not have quite poked through yet, but I basically just delete those points out. I wasn't saying, that's 40 inches away from this plant. You just delete that if it was over, maybe 22 inches or something like that. So I wanted to kind of see how the planters performed at planting using that drone imagery. Now that's something that it's interesting for a farmer. I don't think you're going to do any real in-season decisions with it, but it's really good for monitoring trials, whether that's fertility or seed spacing and things like that. Looking at emergence, whole versus cut seed or different seed sizes. It's useful for looking at that, but the planters performed really well in this study. There was only one kind of area where it had a little bit of trouble, and that's on this field that was already 9 inch was the standard. We targeted 7 3/4, but we really only got probably 8.5 inches was about what it came out to. So it wasn't much different than this year. It was off by about 16% of the target. And everything else was, within pretty much 5%. So the planters all performed fairly well, and I was pretty confident that the trials that we laid out were, what we were intending to do with the exception of this one. So I also looked at how quickly were the rows closing in on those different treatments. So we had, a grower standard, we had a tighter and a wider, and it's basically what you'd expect. Where we planted seed tighter together, the canopy cover, it covered in a little quicker. But I also threw some harvest data in here in terms of size profile, and kind of again exactly what you'd expect. When we put seed tighter together, we had more smalls and we had less 10 ounce. Now I kind of broke this down by zone, so this is still looking at canopy cover here. So the areas of the field where we expect to see a little bit more moisture, generally the stronger areas of the field, they were closing in a bit faster than these kind of more high and dry hilltop areas, even though it was a spring where we had lots of moisture. In the eastern PEI case, we had probably excess moisture. There was some washout issues there after planting, a couple big storms in the spring, and there was even parts of that field, some of the low spots that they didn't even plant. So here again, the percent smalls by zone. This had nothing to do with the planting treatment. So we were seeing more smalls up on these higher and drier hilltops, and we're seeing less 10 ounce. So you look down as we get down into the zones, lower zones on the field, these kind of more greener areas, we're seeing, right near the sweet spot for 10 ounce, about 34%. In that Burbank field, it was about 32% in clear waters. This field, we didn't look at anything in terms of 10 ounce, it was more just paying attention to the smalls. So the results, I kind of broke everything down and just put a dollar value on it, and that's factoring in all the seed costs and the smalls and 10 ounce bonus, contract prices and things like that. So the western field, we knew going into it that putting seed tighter together in what we would consider to be a weaker part of the field probably wasn't going to be a good idea, and that certainly showed here. The grower standard was worth about $4,700 an acre, and it was about $1,100 an acre lower, where we had things tighter together. And then where things were wider, it was actually a little bit less than grower standard, but nonetheless, the trend across the fields was, we get into these zone 1 areas, spacing things out a little bit more makes more sense, and that's what we expected to see going into it. But on this field here, where we have things tightened up a little bit, and this what we consider to be a better performing part of the field, it was worth about $460 more an acre than the grower standard. So if we're able to push things a little bit more in this zone, maybe back off a bit here. That's where we're going to see some of the economic benefits of this variable rate planting. This field here was, it almost looked like the wider spacing worked better almost everywhere. So where we had 9-inch, and this was, the goal was 8, 7 3/4, but it was probably more like 8.5. Maybe the GSP here should be more like 10-inch and kind of vary off of that, but we're still seeing a trend here where things were widened out in this zone 1, it performed better, but even down here in this, what we consider a good zone, the wide was still worth a lot more. We look at the Burbanks. This was interesting in that the trends that we expect to see with variable rate planting still followed. So in this zone 1 area here where we spaced things out, it was worth about $700 an acre more than the grower standard. And as we get down here into the zone 3, the stronger part of the field, it was worth about $180 more than the grower standard. But we see zone 1 here actually outperformed zone 3. So the area that we would consider to be a little bit weaker actually performed better overall than down here. And I think a lot of that had to do with some of that excess moisture from the spring. Like down east or up east, I guess, had a little bit more rain earlier in. I said, they had some erosion issues even after planting in some areas of the field that didn't get planted. So perhaps some of that excess moisture was causing problems down here, and such a good year in terms of rainfall that up here did still perform fairly well. But we're still seeing the trend where spacing things out on these hilltops seemed to work a little better, and tightening things up down here did actually work a little bit better. So to kind of summarize that, 2 of the 3 fields, the wider spacing worked best on the hilltops. 2 of the 3 fields, it worked, tighter spacing worked best in kind of the low 50% of the field, because there's still going to be probably half your field that's going to be planted with kind of a standard rate, kind of depending on how the field's made up. Some fields there might be less variability, and it might be 80% of the fields at more of a standard rate. But if we kind of average out it all across all acres, and include the cost that it would take to map all the fields and everything, there's still a bonus benefit of about $106 an acre for the farmer. So if we took 600 acres a year times $106 an acre, it was about a couple $100,000 over 3 years. So you're not going to go out and buy a brand new planter just to do this probably, but if you're thinking about it, or if you're going to buy a used planter just to think about the capabilities, I talked to HJV on what retrofits and stuff like that might cost, and anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 if it's a hydraulically driven planter. Some of them might just need an unlock of the software. So something to think about. Now this is kind of assuming that the grower standard spacing is the right one, but that's always tricky to figure out, because the right spacing on a dry year as opposed to the right spacing on a wet year might be totally different. So we don't really, it's hard to pin down what's the actual right spacing anyway. And we didn't do any variable rate fertilizer in this trial, so I think there's a lot of potential there. If we can vary fertilizer, likely similar to the way we're looking at varying seed. So with seed we did about 15% less and 15% more than the grower standard. So probably a little bit of room to save some fertilizer and then maybe push things a little bit in another part of the field, but that's almost another trial all in itself. So I think the benefits of variable rate planting might even be more evident in a dry year than a normal or a really good year like last year. Like I said, we had lots of moisture. It's going to kind of mask some of those issues. There's areas of the fields from 2020 when things were dry that we were seeing like 35–40% difference in yield on a really dry hilltop, as opposed to an area that was 100 feet away that had a little bit more moisture. So there could be more potential there in some of those drier years. And that strategy can be used with other crops in your rotation. So we basically use the same maps, but the strategy might be flip-flopped. So out west they do a ton of variable rate seeding of cereal crops and stuff like that, but they actually put more seed on the kind of weaker areas of the field to try and account for higher seed mortality rates. They want to get a nice even stand across the field, uniform emergence, and for timing the fungicide sprays and harvests and everything like that. So there could be a different strategy, but the same type of a map works. And if some of the folks in here have done, used swap maps for variable rate lime or fertilizer or potash, those same maps can be used for a variable rate seeding strategy in the future. So I just kind of added this in here. It's not really about chasing perfect. We'd love to get everything perfect. I think that's a bit of a pipe dream if we can get better. Kind of like Harold was talking about. That's kind of the way forward. You know, flat rate, uniform planting across the field. It might be right in 50 or 60% of the field, and variable rate could be right in 75 or 85% of the field. We're never really going to get it 100, but if we can kind of use some information to try and make better decisions, I think it can benefit the farmer economically for sure. So thanks to folks that were sponsoring my project, the PEI Potato Board, Optimistic Technology, UPEI, the Hort Council, and Montague. And happy to take any questions. You can ask anytime, send me an email or give me a call. I'm happy to take questions now. But
any questions for Evan?
Evan, if we could control our moisture better, i.e. have the option to irrigate, how much does that, that's the right word, mitigate the need to adjust variably for different conditions? Like,
yeah, I would say that would influence your decision on how much, you know, if you have the irrigation, you can mask some of those issues like we've seen, but I think the trends are still there. Like, just because you have irrigation doesn't mean that the topsoil is deeper on the top of your hill as opposed to down the slope, right? So there's still, the patterns I've seen over the last few years looking at yield maps and even on irrigated fields, a lot of the patterns are still there. Like, it will mitigate some of it. I think it might influence your fertility more than anything. Like, you know, you're probably not going to back off on a hilltop when you have irrigation. You probably, because if you know you're going to get the moisture, you're probably actually going to put a little more on there. And then you get down the slope, you might back off a little bit.
so I'm not suggest or questioning that as a reason not to try to improve our soils on hilltops and so on, but I guess just to get some kind of sense in my mind, like, where do you put your most of your energy, or explore the possibilities the most, right?
Push things?
Yeah.
I still think kind of like you probably want to avoid the areas where you're seeing water shift. Of course, you're not going to push things there, but I think kind of those lower areas that you know they don't have drainage issues. Those are probably the spots that maybe you can push things a little bit more.
Right.
I think really Evan and I went to Europe a few years ago, and we saw some guys that were doing this, and they were basically, it was like, you know, every field, whether it's irrigated or non-irrigated, and parts of the field that perform better than others and that are stronger than others. So let's maximize the profitability of our good parts of the fields.
Yeah.
And the parts of the fields that we know struggle, even with irrigation or even with fertility, they only have so much battery. Space it out a little more and make sure that, you know, you're not getting a ton of smalls, or you're not putting the same investment into parts of the field that just don't have the ability to return the same, right? Mm-hmm. That's what Evan showed in these trials, and I think even beyond, say, just variable rate planting, because as you said, not everybody's there right now, or not everybody's got the gear or whatever, and that's a process, you need to do more trials. But even just understanding within your field, like if you have a field that you scan and, you know, or you've got some existing data or whatever, and you say, okay, this side of the field is always the good side of the field, and this side of the field is always the poor side of the field. Even that, you could say, well, I'm going to do this at 14 inches, I'm going to do this at 16 inches, just because I know this field, this side of the field struggles. And this side of the field is always heavy and good and better organic matter and whatever else, so I can afford to tighten it up a little bit and really capitalize on the good side of the field. So beyond just doing anything VR, there's the ability to kind of adjust within field, right? It's not that hard to change, on most planters, to change your spacing. So it's, you know, something you can do.
I think a lot of the benefits of it is impacting the size profile. So if that's really what you're going for, to try and get more consistent, or you know, if I didn't put the total yield from each, you know, zone and treatment up there, I've used crop value, but I think a lot of the benefits in crop value are coming from the size profile differences and stuff too. So
I know in this trial, Evan, you were just looking at each maiden zone and how it was affected by each spacing profile. But Did you try this yet in a whole field scenario with,
Like throwing it, using the shape file and go across the
and
hole?
adjusting it to each zone yet?
No, we didn't.
Would that be the next step?
Yeah, that'll be the next step.
Yeah.
So we tried it in part of the field. Actually, Chris was involved there. There's still challenges though, and there will be hiccups, I would say, from having the equipment dealers being able to coordinate with the manufacturers to figure out what units is this in, like what are we using seeds per acre, or is it what's the spacing? Like there's still some challenges there.
Language and stuff,
Yeah, and like we're dealing with companies, Minima and stuff in Holland and stuff like that. So there'll be a few hurdles I think to overcome, but I would suspect something like this will be more common in another 5 years from now.
Yeah, and then your I guess, leaving one zone and entering another,
Yeah.
it's just a line in the shapefile, but maybe over time it'll be more.
Yeah, we try and build our shape files to be kind of a more smooth transition, so you're not going from like 18 to 14, or to me it could be 18, 17, 16, it could be a gradual change.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks a lot, Evan. You're hanging around for lunch if anybody wants to have any more questions.
Yeah.
So I'll finish things off. I have a few slides to share with you about some AIM trials that we did in the last year. So, I'm mostly going to focus on stuff that we did with our science and tech group, but I am going to talk a little bit about some cover crop stuff as well. Some of you already participated in some of these trials, so thanks in advance for your help in those. So this is what I'm mostly going to go over today. So Harold talked a bit about fall ridging or fall hilling. We've been doing some work on that the last few years, so I'm going to talk about that. We did one trial on foliar fertility with a grower that I'm going to talk about. Compaction mitigation subsoiling. We've been working on that last few years, so we're going to talk about that. Quash fungicide. I'll go into that a little bit more. We did a nitrogen trial, which I'm going to call my accidental nitrogen trial or fertility trial. So I'll explain that more in a few minutes, and then we're going to talk a little bit about cover cropping. So fall hilling, since 2017, we've done 10 trials over 4 years. So in that, we're starting to get a decent little bank of information in terms of understanding, is there an effect of making the hills in the fall compared with not making the hills in the fall? And basically, so what we're doing is, again, we're making these hills or ridges in the fall, in say late August, early September, with GPS, alongside a part of the field that is just left, it's been tilled but not ridged, right? And in these trials, we had some that had cover crops and some that didn't have cover crops, but it was always, both sides were treated the same. So it was either both had cover or both didn't have cover. Most of them had covers, but that's where we are. And then in the spring, most of the time, the growers were able to plant directly into those hills without additional tillage. A couple of them, they might have done a light pass ahead to kind of level the ground a little bit, and then they put their plant into the hills, or like they're more, by that point they're just little bumps, but it didn't require a whole lot of extra work. We had one grower, Ramsey's, they had like kind of like a finger weeder type machine that went over and kind of just roughed up the surface to maybe break up any clumps, that sort of thing. And that's akin to what some folks have done in New Brunswick with this sort of work. But yeah, generally, in the hilling system versus the traditional system, people say one tillage pass usually is about what we were looking at. So over these 10 fields, what we've seen is that on total yield, we don't really see much difference. That's essentially zero. So we don't see a difference on total yield. But there's enough cumulative differences in favor of the hilling on the defects and the quality that we end up getting to about 16.5, 17 hundredweight per acre yield improvement in favor of the hills, and that's a little over $200 an acre on a processing contract. So what does that mean? Like, yes, these are small differences for the most part. There's only one of these fields that was statistically significant, right? But the trend is generally similar. We only had 2 fields that were negative, and one of them's barely negative. So 8 out of 10 are positive. I haven't done the full stats yet on sort of the meta-analysis of all these trials together. We are going to do that. But it seems to be indicating there's probably a slight trend towards a small improvement in yield where we've been doing this hilling. But beyond that, so even if we were really conservative and we said there's no difference in yield, it's not statistically significant, so we can't really say, unless we had 100 fields, we couldn't see whether we had a difference. Even without that, I think that there are benefits to the system in terms of probably a reduced tillage pass in most fields, ability to get the ground worked earlier in the fall, before potato digging, before a lot of your other work, get it done, get it out of the way, get a cover crop established, lots of time for a good cover crop to establish, to build organic matter and to, activate your soil and all the good things that come with that. And we've seen generally where we've put temperature and moisture monitors in where the fall hills are, they generally warm up a little faster than the other side of the field by about a degree, which is important at that time of year. And where the hills were tends to stay a little, retain a little more moisture later in the season. So into July and August. Because again, they've probably had one less tillage pass, so they probably have a little better soil structure. They probably have a little less soil disturbance, so they're holding a little more moisture. So, as I said, even if there was no difference in crop, I think a lot of this is probably still worth your money and maybe worth considering. You may not say it works for every variety, but I think it's worth considering, especially for land that maybe you struggle to get on in the spring, that you want to get dried out a little bit faster, you want to get on a little faster. I think it has some potential. Any comments on what I showed you on fall hilling? This is a slam bam, thank you ma'am, going through a few trials because I don't want to, take us all day. But I did a fact sheet, which I sent the link out on by Agronomy update, but this is on the Agronomy website now. This goes in a little bit more detail on our project and has more the full results and stuff. But if you want to kind of dig into that a little bit more, it's up on the website now.
What did they use for cover, Ryan?
Mostly grain species, so like barley or oats.
Okay. They winter killed mostly, did they?
Yeah. They always winter killed.
And do them costs taken into effect, the extra cost of doing that, and then having the power hiller in the spring and the different things like that?
Well, there's no, between the hilling and the no hilling, there'd be no extra cost, right? You'd have to hill it. It's you'd go through and hill and put the cover crop on, but you still have to put the cover crop on in some fashion. So it's just going through with a hiller and the cover crop versus not. There might be, maybe it costs a little more to pull the hiller than to go through and put the cover crop on. But as I said, I think in most cases people were saving at least one tillage pass, so I think that compensates for that.
So Ryan, just to be clear, then they weren't using any kind of a freshener or anything in the spring much. You said some of them did just a
We
little
only
bit
had
of
I'd
tillage?
say 3 out of those 10 fields used a bit of a freshener, and that was a real light tool that was pulled right ahead of the plant, right before they planted. And so you don't need a big tractor to pull that. Yeah.
But comparing to what the previous speaker that just left did, they used something consistently, did they not, ahead of the planter?
Well, he was doing like a full power hiller,
Yeah.
which we're not doing in this case. Because again, in his case,
His
they've got
soil
heavy
type?
clay soils where they get a lot of lumps and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Here, like what they're doing in New Brunswick when they're doing this, like the guys that are fumigating stuff, and they make the hills in the fall and they fumigate them, and they don't want to destroy the hills because they've got fumigate in them, right?
Yeah.
So they don't want to destroy them again in the spring. So they just go with and that's kind of what they use, is this sort of it's just slanted on the top of the hill, and it just kind of beats the top of the hill off a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's not even like a full tillage, it's just sort of breaking up the top so that if there's any trash or any lumps in the top, they're kind of breaking it. But you don't need much of an implement to, this is just on the toolbar, it's not like a full tillage pass, right? So,
That looks like a rotary mower.
yeah, so,
And were you seeing it much negative impact in heavier spots, like we haven't showed there, the, you know, the kind of the real dry along the one zone and then really wet where the water traffic, were the fields reasonably consistent, or how do you handle those type of situations?
so like on the fields that we did, I tried to pick fairly consistent fields, fairly flat fields to compare side to side, right? And where we did the sampling tended to be, you know, right on the line of where, you know,
Yeah.
where we did it versus where we didn't, to try and control that variability, right?
Yeah.
The growers that did it, especially like, so the one that's done it the most in this trial would be Craig McCluskey, and Craig's got 4 trials out of the 10, and he said that generally where he did the hilling, it was easier to work, it was mellower ground, it was easier to dig, you know, fewer clumps, and he thinks he did see a little bit more yield. So he didn't really see any drawbacks on it, and he's going more towards pretty much the whole farm is going to be that way now.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Ryan, just your point quickly, the hills did warm up a little bit faster as well.
Yes, so they warm up a little
Standard
faster.
practice.
So in theory, you could also, like, if that field warms up an extra, like the soil warms up a degree or a degree and a half faster, you could probably plant in that soil a little bit faster, right? So again, if you got a field that's maybe a little drier or maybe a little slower, this may be an option for getting into it a little faster. So, I mean, in Manitoba and Alberta, you know, Harold's definitely not the only person that ridges. Like Alberta now, that's pretty much standard practice, because they need to get in and plant as soon as possible in April. Like they're done planting before we start, because after September the 15th, you know, they can start getting frosts, right? Pretty heavy frosts. So they want to have everything out of the ground by the 20th of September a lot of the time. So they are a month ahead of us at the start of the season. We have an extra month at the end of the season. So they need to get at it, and they don't want to have wet fields. Foliar fertility, we've had a lot of questions and a lot of discussion in our AIM group about foliar fertility, and a lot of people wanting to try and do some work on that. I had one grower that said, look, I'd be interested in taking a field and doing a split in it. And so what they did is we picked a field that I would say is a pretty average field. So it was you know, mid-2s for organic matter, high P, high K, but that's normal for PEI, pretty middle of the road for most things, okay? A bit of slope, but, you know, not steep slope, just, you know, it's near the shore, so, you know, kind of a gradual slope. This is what the field looked like. It's 2 really long strips. Each of these strips is about 1 kilometer long or so. And what we did is we split each of them in half. So one side would be the foliar fertility treatment, one side would be the standard fertility treatment. This is what the total applied nutrients were pre-plant plus in the planter, so pretty standard fertility package, it's Mountain Gems. And then the foliar would have this plus whatever was recommended from the PDO sampling by the company. So they did PDO sampling every week, and there was 7 foliar applications, and it was a combination of these products. So it wasn't the same thing every week. It was like one week it might just be boron, another week it might be boron and manganese or something like that. But it would be a combination of these products, and over the summer, over the 7 applications, it totaled about $145 in product. I don't have the cost of the spraying in there, because the spraying would be in with the cost of the fungicide application, and you know, when it's regularly going on. No. 178 nitrogens, lots of nitrogen.
Oh, yeah, I just put like any guy will pick
Yeah.
it up quick, so I just
Yeah. And what I'm showing you here, this is July. This was after, I think, the first 2 or 3 foliar treatments were made. And really, you know, there's no obvious trend from side to side in terms of one or the other. You can see there's quite a bit more green in this strip than in this strip. Our sampling area, we took samples in both strips, and I took samples on both sides of this grass waterway. So we took samples here, samples here, samples here, samples here. so that we try and keep it fairly consistent. We didn't go all the way up and down the field. This is what we found. What we found is essentially no difference. These are all definitely not statistically significant, not different than 0. So these could all be differences could all be substituted by 0. When we did truck weights as well, so the grower did 3 trucks. It just so happened that basically one pass with the digger up the field with, one like digger plus 2 windrowers from start to finish would more or less fill a truck. Little bit less than fill a truck. So we took 3 trucks from each treatment and weighed them, and the cumulative total of that was 48 pounds. So 0.1%. So there's no difference. So, and the cost of the foliar program, the testing plus the nutrients was $160 an acre. So I'm not telling you today that foliar programs are not worth using. I'm not telling you that, they may have use in certain programs, certain varieties, certain fields with specific nutrient deficiencies, that sort of thing. I would be saying, pay specific attention to what you're being recommended to use, and does it, do you actually need it? Just because the PDO testing maybe says that, okay, it looks a little low today, doesn't necessarily mean that the crop is really struggling, and if you put down a 200 K and the field was already strong with K, and it's a decently strong growing season, and there's been ample soil moisture, be wary about how much you need. You shouldn't have to put as much foliar fertility on because the crop conditions are good. So again, I would say there are probably cases where a foliar program makes a lot of sense. We know that there's some, especially boron, most of our fields are light on boron, and boron's pretty cheap, and you throw it in with your spray program anyway. There's a lot of cases where that makes lots of sense. Just be cognizant about if you're being told all these products, or just how much is in your fertility program, what's the baseline fertility in your field to start with, just something to consider. We did do a fair bit of sampling here to try and make sure that this was accurate and repeatable and independent. So I'm just showing you what we have, and it's kind of up to you guys as to how it fits in your farm or doesn't fit in your farm.
Ryan, do you think you can use too much boron?
Yes. Too much boron, especially late in the season, can prematurely cause senescence. So it can, if you've got a late season variety that needs to finish on its own, and you put too much boron on, then you can be getting into problems with like specific gravity and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Ryan, back to that previous slide. So what was the difference in fertility between the 2 strips? So the total applied nutrients, was that in the check strip, for example, was that pre-plant and in-planted?
Yeah, so this would be most of it in the planter. A bunch of the K would have been pre-plant.
Yeah.
This would all be in the planter, I think, except for I think there might have been some top dress here as well. But so some of the N was top dress, all the P and half the K likely would be in the planter. But then here, so there's no N and P in the foliar program. It's mostly micros or the minor major nutrients like magnesium. Boron. There was one application of K late in the season, couple applications of zinc, couple applications of mag, that sort of thing.
So did both the check and the test strip get those
Yes.
total applied, and then after?
Yeah, so
The
the
foliar
whole
was
field got this.
Okay.
The whole field got this, and the foliar halves got this plus this.
Okay, gotcha.
And was everything applied, Ryan, based on the performance of the crop? Like, was it assessed with PDO samples and so on, or was this a prescription that was sort of pre-made? And
This would be based on the performance of the what was in the PDO samples, and then how that fit into their algorithm or their recommendation matrix.
right.
So the levels that came from the PDO sampling, and then how that would inform the recommendation.
And was their main objective to try to get more yield, or was there any follow-up done on quality of the tubers and so on?
Well, so we did, of course, size profile, defects, that sort of thing.
Right.
Most of the defects here are hollow heart. No statistical difference. The foliar maybe looks like it maybe had a little bit more 10 ounce, but again, this isn't statistically different, so can't say that there's actually this much difference. There was no difference in smalls. There was no difference in gravity. I don't have gravity on here, but there's no difference in gravity.
And in your mind, Ryan, do you think there's a possibility that there'd be a better skin finish, storageability, those kind of things, or are they typically?
It wouldn't be fair for me to guess on that. I know when I dug them, I didn't see any difference. But again, this is a French fry variety on a French fry contract. So, you know, these are mountain gems. Again, it may be that if these are russet Burbanks that are notoriously poor feeders, you know, the more inefficient feeders, maybe they would have reacted to this program.
Right.
But a variety like mountain gems, which tend to be a little more efficient, they don't tend to have the early dying as much, that sort of thing. We're not trying to keep them alive in August and September the same as a Burbank. That's maybe where we don't see the same benefit, you know. But if it was Yukon Golds, or if it was, you know, Gold Rush or Burbanks that maybe aren't as efficient of feeders and maybe tend to struggle late in the season, maybe we'd see more benefit. So again, that's why I'm not saying nobody use foliar fertility programs. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it comes down to, like, you have to peg it to your field and peg it to your baseline fertility and peg it to your variety and all that sort of stuff.
So the trial shows what it shows on that particular variety.
Yeah, on this particular field, this particular variety, it didn't show a benefit.
Are you doing this again this coming year, or?
This particular grower is not doing this trial again. He's happy with what he saw. If there was another grower that was interested in doing this, I would 100% entertain helping with the you know, trial setup and sampling and all that sort of stuff. So if anybody was interested in doing that, more than willing to work with them on that. But in terms of like this specific grower was happy with what they saw, and it was similar to work that they had done on their own 4 or 5 years ago that had a similar result. So they just said, okay, I'm happy enough with what we've got.
Are you able to share what program they're using for foliar?
I could send you the, like, what products and what schedule they were. Actually, the schedule of the products that was used is in the report that's on the website.
Okay.
So if you go to the website, there's a 5 or 6 page report that goes into more detail on this. I don't tell you the company or exactly what products, but I tell you, like, you know, is it what week did they put the mag on and what week did they put the boron on and that sort of stuff. So compaction mitigation, we've been working on this for a few years now. We have a project that's sort of mid-project with UPEI right now where we're looking at using soil electroconductivity to, can we use soil electroconductivity to detect compaction in the field? So tell maybe what parts of the field have more soil compaction than another. And can we also use it to say how deep is that compaction so that we can possibly tailor any subsoiling that we do on a depth basis? Because we know going out in the field and doing a bunch of penetrometer readings, most people don't even have a penetrometer, and then if you have a penetrometer, you're running all over the field trying to, you know, and then putting that into a, say like a map or something, that's problematic, time consuming. So can we use a type of mapping that we already have access to and be able to come up almost with a variable rate ripping program? That's kind of what we're looking at. As part of this, we wanted to see, is there benefit of subsoiling the year before potatoes are planted versus no subsoiling? So again, we're trying to target the subsoiling in the summer or early fall when the soil is dry, the best time to subsoil. Doing that subsoiling at the correct depth below the plow pan or below the hard layer, does it have an impact on yield? So we did 2 fields in East Prince that were subsoiled last summer, so like July 2020, and then they were potatoes in 2021. And both of them had a subsoiled section and a check, okay? And first field was Alverstone russets, and the second field was Mountain Gem russets. So the field at Alverstones, there's not a whole lot of difference on, say, quality attributes. There was no difference in specific gravity, but there was a bit of a difference on yield. Now this is, I haven't actually run the stats on this. I'd say this is approaching significance. It's probably pretty close to being statistically significant in this field, and we have about $400 and some an acre. So definitely looks like there is a trend towards that. This was a good field, strong field. It had irrigation in it, but the irrigation wasn't turned on because they didn't need it. This field, the Mountain Gems, again, we don't see as much difference here. Like, these would not be statistically significant. We see a little more difference in the total yield than in the marketables, because the subsoil had better 10 ounce, but there might have been a little difference in defects. I don't know. What I will say is this field was definitely impacted by wireworm and grub damage. And wireworm and grub damage, I don't imagine it had anything to do with the subsoiling, but I imagine it just had to do with where that field was, where our samples were in comparison to the edge of the field. And we all know that sometimes this stuff is very pocketed within a field, isn't widespread through a field. Most of these defects are wireworm and grub damage, which is a pretty high rate for a processing variety. So bear that in mind. It may have compromised our results slightly. If we look at total yield, we're not that far off of what we found in the other field. So we're going to do this again. We subsoiled, or we had 2 more fields last fall, that were subsoiled versus not subsoiled, and they'll be in potatoes this year.
What was the first variety again?
Alverstone russets.
Going by your results, yeah, I think the biggest bang for the grower's buck would be to pick the other variety.
Yeah, Alverstone russets as well. But anyway, it said this field. These fields were about, I don't know, 5 kilometers away from each other. Same grower, but 5 kilometers away from each other. And this field didn't have a history of wireworm damage, but had this year. So, and they hadn't put on, because they didn't have a history of problems, they hadn't put on any insecticides and that sort of thing. So we had some trouble.
Did they use any kind of controlled traffic in this drawing, or just?
No, just standard, field procedures. That's the only difference in the field and how the field was managed was the year before. Part of it was subsoil versus not.
So subsoil, you said in July or something like that. So would that have been in a cover crop?
So both of these fields would have been in like a timothy or clover type hay crop, and then they went through subsoil. And then I think both of these fields, then they would have been roundupped in September and chisel plowed for the specific crop. On quash, we have done 2 years on this, so this may be a little bit new to some folks. So I saw some research from the United States where on long season varieties like Russet Burbanks and Clear Waters and a few other different long season varieties, use of quash, which is a early blight fungicide, the chemical name is metconazole, using it independent of its effect on actual early blight, seemed to give about a 25 to 30 hundredweight yield bump on those long season varieties. And the theory is that it looked like, when they looked at the imaging, where they used the quash, they were a little lighter green, they matured a little faster, and then those long season varieties that helped speed up tuber development and bulking. So we said, okay, well, let's try that in PEI, let's see if we see that here. So last year we did 2 fields, both of them down in the down past Surrey, both of them in Russet Burbanks. One was up a little, one was down a little, no statistical difference. You add them together, they're a wash. So we said, okay, last year was a dry year. What do we see this year? So this year we did 4 fields, 2 Russet Burbanks again, Surrey area, 2 Clear Waters in East Prince. Quash was applied first or second spray before or at row closure, and what it was half the field would be quash in the total fungicide mix, and half would be their grower standard practice, which in all cases was Luna Tranquility. So they all had early blight fungicide, it's just we used quash instead of Luna on half the field. So on the Clear Waters, I averaged the two fields together because they were very close to each other and had very similar results. And basically, no statistical difference. So yes, there's positives here, but there's no statistical difference there. These could easily all be 0 across the board by probability. And I don't have gravity on here, but there's no difference in gravity in these trials. When it comes to the Burbanks, again, these are all, most of these, the yield ones are not statistically different. Where the only two variables where we saw a difference was gravity and 10 outs, which were in favor of the check. And those were significant, I'd say a 90% confidence, or like 9 times out of 10, that's our confidence that these were different. So, if we add those all together, I don't see a trend of any positivity. If anything, there may be a trend towards negativity. So I don't see enough to really go forward with this. These were a couple NDVI maps that Evan did for me, actually, so thank you, Evan. And again, like that's the line. You look on both sides of the line, there's no obvious difference. Like there was no obvious difference in canopy. We didn't see the differences that they saw in the United States. Why? I think a big part of it is, in PEI, most of our fertilizer goes on at planting. And in general, we put on more than enough nitrogen. And especially for some of these long season varieties, I can tell you that both of these fields would have had 200 plus kilograms of nitrogen, or pounds of nitrogen per acre on. That is enough to keep that field green for quite a while, especially in a growing season like this. So, I think any amount of maturity or speed up that the quash might have done would have been counteracted by the fact that there was lots of nitrogen there to keep those fields immature. In the United States, where they mostly did these trials in the Midwest and the West, they're putting on some nitrogen before, but then they're spoon feeding it all season through the fertigation, right? So they're matching the nitrogen to the needs of the crop, and they want to get that field matured at an even rate so that they can get it dug in September and not in October. So I think that's probably the reason why we didn't see the difference here. Or maybe there is no difference either. So long story short, we're not going to go forward with this trial, but this may not make a big difference to you because you may not have even heard of quash. I feel duty bound to report the results of our trials to you because some things work and some things don't. So that's what we got. Any questions about this?
What's the price difference on the two products, quash and Luna?
Quash is about 2.5 times more expensive than Luna. So it's pretty straightforward. If they were to bring in, like if this worked and showed a difference, and they were to bring in like skids of it, probably would be almost the same price as Luna. But at the small amounts we were bringing in, it wasn't. Like in the United States, it's actually the same price or cheaper than Luna because it's used more often. It's an old chemistry, it's not a new chemistry. It's been around since the 80s. We did an accidental fertility trial. So in this field, we had a grower that had an 8-acre field, Mountain Gems, planted in May. And didn't notice, basically, until we got 2/3, 3/4 of the way over the field, that one of the tubes, fertilizer tubes, was blocked on the planter. So, every 6th row wasn't getting any fertility down at planting. All it was getting was the pre-plant fertilizer. So, you can see here, the difference between every 6th row and the rest of the field is 150 pounds of nitrogen, 180 pounds of P, 100 pounds of K, and 25 pounds of mag. Pretty significant difference. The field was a strong field by PEI standards, high organic matter, good pH, so that these would be more available. It's really super high P, reasonably high K, not, mag's a little low, calcium's a little low, but not critically low, good CECs. You could see very easily in the field, like there's a row, there's a row, there's a row, there's a row, there's a row. Like you could see it really easily. You could see them highway, the Concora highways out here. I could see it from the road, like you could see it back. It was pretty obvious, right?
One of them ones where you want to throw a few flags in there quick.
So the grower said, hey, Ryan, come put a few flags in here and we'll take some samples. So that's what we did. And even after the field was dead, you could tell the fields that were the low fertility fields, because the stalks were rigid and upright and like stock upright, whereas the other stuff was laying down. So it was a little easier to tell. You could see they were lighter green, they were more upright. But we did strips in the 6 rows, and we did strips in everything else. 25 difference in total yield. I mean, no difference in marketable yield. Like, none of this is statistically significant except for these two. These two are statistically different. So, the check at 200 pounds of nitrogen had 14% hollow heart. And the low fertility had 2. There was 11 points difference in gravity. Now we know low nitrogen is associated with high gravity, so you know that's not a surprise. It's quite different, and it was making quite a difference on the pay. This is still not far off the optimum, but you know this is quite high. There's a difference in the 10 ounce. It wasn't statistically different, but it's getting close to it. But 28% 10 ounce isn't too far off from your maximum on your 10 ounce bonus anyway. Like, you're not that far off from it. So in terms of balancing it out, you're still, even with a little bit of difference in the yield here, which again isn't statistically different, so there's no difference in payout.
There must have been lots of that mycorrhizae going on there, sharing it with each other or something.
Well, and see, that's the thing, is this field's in a 3-year rotation, and you know, potato plants don't reach that far to the side of them.
No, it's just joking.
So, what I'm saying is, obviously I would never recommend somebody to plant that low a fertility program in their potatoes. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this shows that in fields that are stronger, fields that have high P and K, fields that have decent organic matter, fields that are you have a good soil test and you have some ability to know what you're starting with, there is probably room to reconsider your fertility programs, especially as we're heading into a very expensive fertilizer year. So if you're starting with 300, 400, 500 ppm P, and you're starting with 250 ppm K, and you're starting with good micros or reasonably good micros, consider how much fertility you're putting on, because what you're putting on may not actually be giving you any incremental yield. And with 50N, we still had 322 underweight. We still had 290 pay, you know.
Do you think it would have been the same if it would have been 6 consecutive rows beside each other that had the pour?
There might have been some, there may be some difference of that row next to the next row. There may be some difference. I'm not discounting that there could be some difference, right? But again, potato roots do not go that far, especially when there's a furrow in the middle, right? They don't go around and up, you know, like they just don't. So they tend to go to the furrow and they stop and they go down. Yeah. So I don't think you're going to get that much extra benefit from the fertility that you put in the other row, right? So again, yeah, there could be some difference. Again, I'm not recommending radical changes to fertility programs. That'd be irresponsible. And Chris would be mad at me. And, you know, like, it is what it is. I'm just saying, I get a lot of soil tests back at 300 to 400 ppm P. And that is about enough P to plant 10 crops of potatoes in how much P the potatoes actually use. If you noticed what Harold had his P in some of his fields in pounds per acre. So pounds per acre is half of the ppm. Or sorry, no, you multiply the ppm by 2 to get the pounds per acre. So his pounds per acre was at 9. So that means on ppm they'd be 4.5, and we're at 400. And he's still getting potato crops. Now he's putting on starter P and that sort of thing. But like, there's a big difference, and we've got lots of P on a lot of these fields. I know that
available though.
I know, but again, 6.2%, 6.2 pH almost a lot of that P is available. Like and as you go up, as you go further towards 6.5, it becomes even more available. You know, so yes, some of the P is bound by aluminum and iron, but there's a curve as to where, and it's very much dependent on pH as to where it is in terms of how much of it's available, right? But your potato crop, a 300 bag potato crop, only displaces 30 to 35 pounds of P in the actual potato crop, right? So again, yes, a lot of this isn't available. Let's say even half of it's not available, or let's say even 3/4 of it isn't available. You still got loads, you know, for what your crop's going to take out.
Not for 2.5 crops.
So where I'm getting at is, and this has been backed, what I'm saying has been backed up, there's been local research by Ag Canada, by Judith Naraneza, by other people, that comparing 160, 180 pounds like P versus 80 pounds P had no difference in yield, year after year after year after year.
And that's taken into account, Ryan, drier, wetter years and everything.
Yeah.
We did an accidental trial where we were missing the P in our planter mix. It wasn't hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all standing up and the yield was down. And we added P when we were top dressed.
Right. So again, this field was a strong field. You know, it's a high organic matter field. It's a reasonably good pH field. I mean, there's a lot of fields lower than this in pH and PEI, you know. Again, you take into consideration of what you have to begin with, right? So would I recommend anybody's putting 0 P on their fertility program? Absolutely not. You know, I'm just saying that maybe it doesn't need to be 160 or 180. You know, if you're looking for an opportunity to save some money on fertility in a year when the fertilizer costs are going through the roof. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying cut your P to 0 and all that stuff. Like again, and it's to the timing of the release of P, right? P is less available in cool soils. So that's why people are looking at, you know, starter liquids like Harold was talking about. He puts his P on. It's a starter liquid at the time of planting. You know, it's most available at the time of rooting and germination and all that sort of stuff, when the crop really is a high demand for P, and when soils are cool and it may be less available. So and yes, we have a complication rate in terms of the amount of aluminum and iron in our soil. So again, if you're looking at your soil tests, look at that P saturation index that's on there as well, and that will tell you a little bit about your P in relation to your the aluminum and the iron in your soil, and that again is a tool to help you decide how maybe you change your P rates. Erica?
Do you guys ever do tuber analysis for nutrient content? Just some of these trials, I think it would have been interesting to see.
Yeah, we haven't particularly done that in any of our trials, but I know there are trials infertility trials that do that, especially around like calcium and things like that. They often do that.
Not really a question, just a point. I took about 1,500 soil samples that I had sampled over the last couple of years and kind of compiled them all together, and we had the zone information for each. But one trend that we see on PEI pretty much across the board is the highest P levels are up on our hilltops.
Yeah.
Likely due to, you know, not the crop not removing as much, and then when you look at things like pH, it's usually lower up there too.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, you know, a little bit more lime up there might unlock some of that. And when you think about a VR lime strategy, and typically we're seeing our organic matter levels are lower up there too. So, but maybe, you know, maybe something as simple as adding a little bit more lime might make some of that a bit more available.
And that's a good point too, like in a year where, okay, if you've got a field that's got a fair amount of background fertility, but your pHs are less than 6 or, you know, they're lower, a lime strategy to make those, you know, those elements, those nutrients more available, that may be cheaper than the actual, but not a whole lot more nutrients, right? You know, because I don't think lime has increased the same amount of price this year as a lot of the, you know, the nutrients have. So again, you know, it depends on your market. You know, are you worried about scab? Is it a scabby field? Like, you know, what variety you're growing? Like that. There's lots of things that go into this. You need to talk to your agronomists, you need to talk to your advisors, all that sort of stuff. I'm not trying to say anything too radical today. I'm just saying, based on the research, this one little trial, which again, It's an accidental trial. All it does is it gives us something to talk about. This isn't something you go home and say, well, based on this trial, I'm going to go and put down 150 less nitrogen. That's not what I'm saying. But it's something to talk about. It's something to have the discussion. And then based on this, but also based on the work that's been done by Ag Canada and Cavendish Farms and other people, there's a lot of evidence that we probably over-fertilize, especially for some of these newer varieties. And that's the other main point. Mountain Gems are more resistant than russet Burbanks. They're shorter season than russet Burbanks. And they don't seem to have the same, they seem to be a little bit more efficient feeders than russet Burbanks. Russet Burbanks are notoriously inefficient feeders, right? So, and there's some other varieties that are like that too. So again, we got to take that into account, you know. So if you're growing newer varieties like Dakotas and Mountain Gems and, you know, Satinas and other varieties that maybe they're bred to be a little bit more feed efficient, they're bred to be a little bit more resistant to early dying or other diseases, you don't need that extra nitrogen that you used to need to keep the Burbanks going through August and September as much on these varieties, so maybe that allows you to back it off a little bit. That's the conversation we're having. We had a lot of folks in our trials and outside of our trials with the Mountain Gems this year having a big problem with hollow heart. And when I go and look at where they had hollow heart and where they didn't, mostly it was on the higher nitrogen rates, right? So there's too much nitrogen, they stayed immature longer, it impacted their growth schedule and their growth curve, and that's where they got some of the hollow heart issues. So anyway, it's food for thought. If you want to see on your fields, on your varieties, consider doing this. This would be a great year to do this. You know, have the strip in the middle of the field or the strip on the side and say, I'm going to back the fertilizer off 15%, 20%. And then do your own digs in the fall and see what the difference is. You know, I'm not, again, don't need to be radical here, but you know, 10, 15%, do you see a difference? If you don't see a difference, and you don't see a difference a couple of years in a row on those varieties, that'll inform you about maybe you can back the fertility off a little bit.
Why would you expect, like, how much difference you would see in your soil, what the soil is retained in potash and phosphorus? Probably you'd be taking quite a bit of the base level of potash down a
Yeah,
bit.
so it would be interesting to see if I went back into this field and sampled those rows versus the other rows. I would imagine I would see quite a bit less. I probably wouldn't see much difference in P, but I'd see quite a bit of difference in K likely, right? I'd probably see 100, you know, 100 ppm difference. Probably.
That doesn't explain where it got the N.
Well,
right?
but N is mineralized by the organic matter and that sort of thing as well, right? Like we don't, we may start with 0 nitrate in the spring because our soils don't hold nitrate, but you know there was a legume in that field the year before, so that plus the regular organic matter in the field is going to mineralize nitrogen through the year. So you're never starting with 0. We often, when we do our nutrient planning, we say that we start with 0 because we don't know exactly how well to manage it. And then maybe we'll give a credit for clover, or you know, we'll give a credit for alfalfa, but it's just a number and it's not very scientific. Whereas if you saw Harold's soil test sheet that he had up there, based on what his organic matter is, this is how much nitrogen credit he gave him, right? And it went up with when the organic matter went up. So we don't tend to have that, like we don't have that nailed down here. We're, like there are people that are working on it. The province is working on it with Dave Burton and that sort of stuff. So we are trying to kind of nail that down a little bit better. But
He had a ton of worms in that field. They were making their own.
yeah.
Maybe.
Anyway,
Interesting.
so you guys can all go home and say that Ryan Barrett is crazy as hell. But I'm just saying, going into a year when fertilizer prices are going through the roof, if you can find a way to save the 10% or the 15% or even in the nitrogen, you know, back it off a little bit, but the stuff that you don't back off, put it into some slow release stuff that's going to be available a little later and isn't going to leach in the spring, like that sort of thing. There's some options there too. The last thing I want to talk about is cover cropping before potatoes. So this, I've been talking about this for a couple of years. This is a project we're doing through the Living Labs, where growers are going in late August, early September and tilling the ground, mostly with like a vertical tillage or res till type machine, sometimes with a plow, and then seeding a cover crop. And we're comparing that against doing the tillage and not seeding a cover crop, right? So the only difference between is the cover crop. Why are we looking at this? Because if you can get that land prepared earlier, under the right conditions, you've got lots of time for a healthy green cover crop to establish. You're going to keep that field green longer, which is good for combating soil erosion. It's good for, you know, helping the microbial communities in the soil. It's good for building organic matter. We build organic matter underneath, not from the top down. So 80 to 85% of the organic matter we build in the ground is from soil microbes and the action and the exudates from roots, not from anything that we plow into the ground. So that's really important to keep ground as green as long as we can. And we pick species that winter kill so that you don't have to spray them off in the spring. You don't have to do the, you know, extra tillage, extra stuff to get it ready in the field. We did have one field in this trial where the barley did last over the winter, but that was kind of surprises. But we had a mild winter and some of it survived. But most of the time, it winter killed and it wasn't too easy to get rid of. And even the stuff that didn't winter kill, it, you know, reasonably easy to get rid of in the spring with a spray. So why is this additionally of interest? Because we have seen both locally and in other places published evidence of, in potato vegetable rotations, of a yield improvement following cover crops. So, and actually they've seen a long-term yield improvement following cover crops in most crops. But if you're doing corn and soybeans, 4 and 5% increase in yield in corn and soybeans, that maybe pays for the cover crop, or maybe a little bit more. You know, long term, you're trading money for money. There's long-term benefits, but you're not going to see that direct payment in the crop. In our potato and vegetable systems, where we've got so much high-value crops, 5 or 10% yield bump is pretty significant. So it's something that we look at. This is the type of stuff we're looking at. So this was like a oilseed radish compared with a no cover strip. This was barley, just spring barley that was seeded early September, and this picture's taken like end of October. So just in those 2 months, we got a nice big healthy mat of barley, and then this completely died out over the winter and wasn't a problem in the spring. This is the data from 2020. So all of these are comparisons of the cover crop versus the check. And the trend we saw over 8 comparisons was about 24 hundredweight improvement in marketable yield and about $400 in crop value improvement. And in 3 of the 8 comparisons, it was statistically significant, and it was only negative in 2 out of 8. Okay, so that's what we saw last year, or the last crop year, and I shared this with you last winter. And you know, this is a positive trend, and this fits very closely to the trend that we've seen in other places. The trend that we saw over 60, 70 fields in England was 2,500 hundredweight per acre. It was very much in the same range. So we thought, okay, we're on the same track. We're on, you know, we look like we're not out to lunch here, but we've got 2 more years of this trial. So we had more fields that were planted in cover crops in 2020 that were in potatoes in 2021. So again, these are our comparisons. This is the crops. This is the comparison of the cover with the no cover check. Again, on marketable yield, 2,900 weight or 2,500 weight on the total yield. Not a whole lot of difference on the defects or anything. These are all would definitely not be statistically significant, like they're pretty much a wash. But we see very much the same trend on the payout and the yields. And again, 3 of the fields were statistically significant, 3 of them were negative, 2 of them were slightly negative, and probably statistically 0. This one's a bit lower, this one's a bit higher and not statistically significant, but getting close. So again, if we're looking at the trend over 13 comparisons over 2 years, 5 are negative and 8 are positive, and the overall trend is 25 to 30 hundredweight. When we took this year and I pooled all of the checks and all of the covers together, just to do a direct comparison of check versus cover. And again, we're in this, not much difference in defects, not much difference in the quality, and not statistically different, but it is statistically different for yields, marketable yields, and crop value. Now, I personally think these numbers are probably a touch high, but I'm more comfortable saying this sort of 2,500 weight, that's probably about where we've been over the last 2 years. I had to take 2 trials out of this comparison. Like, we had 2 trials that we did that I took out of here. One, because there was a considerable amount of unexpected traffic in our sampling area, which I didn't really know until later. And then there was one of them that had a really serious issue with wireworm, and that was uneven over the field, and I don't really think was too much to do with the cover crop, so I kind of just pitched that one. And we didn't throw out the research, but it's not included in these tables because that data is a bit compromised. But we have 9 more fields set up in this last year that'll be in potatoes this year. And at the end of the project, we'll pool all of that together and be able to show you over 25 fields or so, what do we see, what's the trend that we see. And we also, by that time, will also hopefully have a little better idea, what's the effect of planting date, what's the effect of seeding rate, what's the effect of the method of planting, what variety or what cover crop species works better. So does mustard work, or does radish work better than barley or something like that. So that's the stuff that we're going to try and figure out a little bit too. Right now, it's a little premature for me to say that spring barley is better than radish. We've seen good and bad on both, so we got a little bit more story to tell there.
So the crops you're doing that on would have been like a hay crop or a cereal?
Yeah, mostly. Some of them were a grain crop, but most of them were on like a 3-year rotation, and this is following a hay crop or something like that. So most of these cases, and Morgan, you correct me if I'm wrong, if I say anything wrong, most of these cases, they sprayed the hay crop in August, and then they worked it in late August, early September. And it was alfalfa, timothy, clover, some sort of mix. A couple of them may have been Sudan grass or something like that. But yeah, and I know at least one of them was a wheat field. But yeah, usually following a forage.
And seeding it right in, or just spreading it on?
So most of the ones that were like, say, radish or radish mustard, most of those, that's where like they have the box on say the lemkin or the Synchro or something, and it's pretty easy because you're only putting on 8 to 10 pounds an acre type thing. So most of those ones, it was done one pass with the tillage. Where it was the barley, I think a couple of the barley were done in the same way, like the seeder on the tillage equipment, but that you have to keep filling it all the time, so it's a little bit more, bit of a pain in the arse. More of the oats and barley were done just broadcast. And then maybe some of them were just broadcast and left on the surface. Sometimes they were broadcast in maybe a very light scuffle to increase soil contact type thing. Or rolled. We had a couple where they rolled it just again to try and get a little more soil contact.
Your top 2 there, both the radish and mustard, is that just different varieties of each or something? Or
these ones, this was the same mix, just on 2 different farms, and it was like it's mostly radish with a little bit of mustard. So it's like a Icarus radish and Terminator mustard mix that was, I think, Phillips sells. So they just happen to be the same mix on 2 farms.
It's 2 different fields.
one was good and one was bad?
Or one, yeah. One of them had high defects. I don't know whether those defects, I think, were wireworm too, so you never know. Sometimes that can kind of throw things off a little bit. That's why, I can't say that these are statistically different, even though there's almost minus 20. There's lots of variability in there we can't explain. So that's why I try, looking at the trends over multiple fields over multiple years rather than one field at a time. Anyway, that's where we're at on cover crops. We got more work to do, but this is where I would say, right now, based on 2 years of work, putting on these fall cover crops where, again, we're not aiming for some convoluted, complicated, expensive cover crop, we're looking for something reasonably cheap at reasonably small seeding rates, somewhere in the realm of $40 to $50 an acre, and we're looking at somewhere in the range of $400 an acre improvement in marketable yield on a processing contract. That's worth investigating. Even if this was half of that, you're still at a 5-to-1 payback. Plus all of the long-term benefits that does for your field, right? That you can't quantify immediately. That's the battling erosion and improving soil organic matter and improving soil health and all those sort of things. So what I would say is a lot of you in this room are doing this. And you're doing this on quite a few fields. And according to the survey that we did there back just before Christmas or so, we're up to 40–50% of fields going into potatoes have something green ahead of them, which is great. You know, like I think that's, hopefully you're starting to see some of these benefits, you know. But I would say that there's lots of evidence that looks like this is a good practice to look at. It fits your rotation. So.
Obviously, no extra fertilizer added to feed that cover.
Don't put fertilizers on fall cover crops. Never put fertilizer, well, maybe not never. 95% of the time, don't put fertilizer on a fall cover crop, because there should be, for the amount of growth you're going to get, there should be enough fertilizer there should be enough fertility in your field. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, if you're just doing something ahead of potatoes that's going to winter kill, and you're not going to actually like take off, and even winter wheat,
could get away with it.
Most people don't fertilize winter wheat in the fall. You fertilize it in the spring, you know, but unless you got a real struggling field.
I wonder, a lot of these fields would have been the first go around doing this, or maybe a second. Do you think over time you may see more improvement, like after?
Possibly, like as you get, I mean, if you always had a field set up where this part of the field always had the cover and this part always had no cover, then yeah, you probably would start to see it wide, you know, but, you know, just because I think over time you will see a growth in organic matter. There was a study in a field tomato system, so not exactly the same as a potato system, but it's also potatoes. Certain tomatoes are related, and it's a heavy, intensive field crop vegetable system like ours in Ontario. And it's a 4-year crop rotation. And in 2 crop rotations, so in 8 crop years, they compared no covers versus 6 out of 8 years covers. And in those 8 years, they improved organic matter by about 0.5%. No, this was Laura Van Erd at Bridgetown. So, you know, just by doing covers, they increased organic matter by about 0.5% in 8 years.
And that was only a fall cover, Brian? Not sacrificing
That's
a crop.
That's cash crop every year,
yeah.
And a cover after 3 out of 4 cash crops. So they couldn't do a cover after, I think after corn or soybeans, one of the two. There wasn't enough time to get a cover, but everything else they had a cover. And one of those covers was winter wheat that then became its own cash crop. But the other cash crops were like mustard or radish or fall rye or something like that. Right? So there is hope, you know, around the use of cover crops. You know, it isn't just keeping the neighbors happy. It isn't just looking good. It is, you know. There's potentially some short-term benefit for your crop, and then long-term health of your soil. So, and then of course we're doing more work on this. We're doing work on covers after potatoes, so we'll have more data to share on that. We're doing work on like the soil building crops and the disease suppressive crops. We'll have more information to share on that. We're going into our last year of the Living Labs program. So all the fields that were set up last year are potatoes this year, and then we'll hopefully be transitioning to a new Living Labs, you know, starting in 2023. But that's where we're at for now. So. Any other questions before we finish up? Pizza here, Morgan?
Yes.
Okay. We're not going to keep people from pizza. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Well, I very much appreciate your attendance today. I know that it has been a crappy winter all around. And I want you to know that I personally and Morgan and people in the office, we feel for you. We're trying to do our best to help you. I know that even just getting people's headspace to come to meetings like this is sometimes difficult with everything that's going on and all the stress that's going on and everything. So I really do appreciate you being here. I hope that it provides value to you. I hope that it was a useful morning. Just take your morning to come here. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you want Harold's contact information to find out more from him, I can give that to you. All of our trial results are now loaded on the Agronomy site. Probably going to do a couple of little one-off webinars that are, well, not even webinars. I think they're going to be more like, ask me questions sessions on Zoom. So I might have 10 or 15 minutes of presentation on a topic and then just asking questions on what we did. And do it at lunchtime or something like that for an hour or half an hour. So maybe keep an eye out for that. But if there's anything that you want to see us cover in AIM, anything that you want to see us do in trials, anything that you want to see us, cover an extension that we're not covering, give me a holler, send me a text, send me an email. Happy to hear from you. That's my contact info. Spud Chat is back. Took a little hiatus there in the fall and before Christmas. Trying to go back to every week now. Should have one coming out on Thursday with Dave Burton on nitrogen. Got a few more to record. Thanks as always to our funding partners, so Cavendish Farms and the Province PEI and the growers. It's your guys' program, and I want you to know that it is your program, and your direction and interest is integral to AIM being successful. So please be sure to let me know what you like and what you don't like. Okay? Peace time.